Well, families, law enforcement, and political leaders are joining forces to save people caught up in the opioid crisis. But during the late 1980s crack epidemic, it was a very different story.
3 years ago, reporter Ruben Castaneda struggled with crack use while working at the Washington Post, even writing a book about his experiences. He joined us today to talk about a number of issues about the drug epidemic. Thank you for joining us. Now, I understand you had your issues with crack many years ago. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. I came to Washington, D.C. in September of 1989 to work for the Washington Post as the nighttime crime reporter. What my Post editors did not know at the time was that I was an active crack user at that time, and in fact was not just somebody who was experimenting. I was a pretty hardcore crack addict. So for a period of about 2.5 years, I covered the crack wars, the violence in the city, while at the same time struggling with my own addiction.
Now, you wrote a book about these experiences called S Street Rising, and during that time you talked about the response the society had to this issue, quite different from what we're seeing now with the opioid crisis.
Well, that's right. During the response to the crack epidemic was increased enforcement. In fact, the very month that I moved from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. to work for the Post, President George H.W. Bush held a nationally televised address from the White House in which he declared a war on drugs, specifically on crack cocaine. And as a prop, he had some large bags of crack on his desk that had been seized by DEA agents during a sting in front of the White House. So that the whole mindset at that time was to try to arrest. The authorities wanted to try to arrest their way out of the problem, arrest dealers, users, and as a result, there was that gave a great boost to the move toward mass incarceration, which was already in flux at that time.
Obviously, and you talk about the response to this issue. Do you see it as a different response to the opioid addiction problem as opposed to the crack?
It's a starkly different response. The reaction to the opioid issue has been, on the part of policymakers and many others, has been to treat this as a public health issue. To the people who are addicted are viewed as people who have a medical problem, which is true, and who need help and treatment and rehabilitation. And that's not. There wasn't a whole lot of talk about that during the crack epidemic.
Any ideas on what's that all about?
Well, I think there's a number of different issues at play. I think certainly one thing that's one very obvious difference is that there was a high level of inner city violence associated with the crack epidemic. This was not, by and large, people hooked on crack committing violence. This violence was primarily drug gangs and crews fighting each other over drug turf, corners, streets, housing projects, and a subculture of violence grew out of that. So it wasn't, I want to make clear that the violence that occurred during the crack epidemic was not primarily violence that was committed by drug users. What we are seeing today are probably a greater number of deaths, though, from overdoses, opioid overdoses. Just last year, in 2016, the preliminary federal figures show that about 64,000 deaths from opioid overdoses. That's a tremendous number. That's more than the number of U.S. soldiers killed during the entire Vietnam War.
Is there a difference in the race and the ethnicity of the users between the two?
Well, certainly another reason that a lot of people have pointed to is that the crack epidemic was associated with Black and Latino addiction, whereas most of the addicts who are falling prey to opioids are whites. Now it's hitting a lot of whites in suburban and rural areas. And I think that it's easier for people in power, politicians, to empathize with someone who reminds them of themselves. And in fact, we have some very specific examples. Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, has talked very movingly about the drug issue. He has talked about a close friend who fell victim to opioid addiction. Jeb Bush and Carly Fiorina, it's been in the press. They both have had kids who were addicted. So I think that that people in power, people in political positions, have perhaps a greater natural empathy.
We're about to wrap up. Just real quick, do you think it would be different if there was the same level of compassion as there is today?
If there was the same level of
Compassion for those addicted to crack?
I think that it would have. The outcome for that, certainly, I think that there was an entire law passed in 1986, a federal law that created much harsher penalties for people with crack cocaine versus powder. I think it was 100-to-1 disparity. So you've got entire neighborhoods in inner cities that were hollowed out because young men were caught up in federal charges. Many of them were not even accused of any violent acts. They were just part of a drug crew, and they got federal charges, and they went away for 20 or 30 years, hollowed out entire neighborhoods in inner cities.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for joining us and sharing your enlightening experiences with us on this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Well, the bill was introduced in Congress last month called Combating the Opioid Epidemic Act. The bill would put $4.5 billion annually for 10 years into state drug programs.